On Christmas Eve, my husband collapsed. My son pushed me away. "Stop. You're just a housewife. You'll kill him." My daughter-in-law nodded. "You can't even bake properly. Don't try to be a hero." They called the city's top cardiologist. When the doctor arrived, he saw me pressing a spot on my husband's neck. He turned pale, dropped his bag, and yelled, "Wait, are you truly who I think you are?" They immediately froze when they discovered who the housewife truly was. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled our Westchester home that Christmas Eve, mixing with the familiar scent of Clarence's aftershave as he adjusted the lights on our 20-year-old artificial tree. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, my hands still damp from washing the dinner dishes, feeling that quiet contentment that comes from decades of shared routines. "Trinity, could you bring me that box of ornaments from the hall closet?" he called, his voice slightly strained from reaching toward the higher branches. I was already moving toward the closet when it happened. A sound I'll never forget, like air being suddenly sucked from the room, followed by a heavy thud that seemed to shake the hardwood floors beneath my feet. Clarence lay crumpled beside our coffee table, his face an alarming shade of gray, his body unnaturally still. The Christmas ornament he'd been holding, a small glass angel we'd bought during our honeymoon 28 years ago, lay shattered beside him, catching the tree lights like scattered tears. "Clarence!" I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands automatically moving to check his pulse. Weak, irregular, barely there. His breathing was shallow, labored. Every instinct I'd spent 25 years burying suddenly surged to the surface. I was reaching for his neck, finding the specific pressure point I knew could help stabilize his heart rhythm, when the front door burst open. Edward stormed in with Sarah close behind, their voices sharp with panic. "Mom, what happened?" Edward's eyes were wide, taking in the scene, his father on the floor, me kneeling beside him. "He collapsed," I said, not looking up, my fingers still pressed against the precise spot on Clarence's neck. "We need to call 911. Sarah was already on her phone, but Edward grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Stop! Don't touch him like that. You're just a housewife. You'll kill him." The words hit me like a physical blow. Just a housewife. I stared at my son, this 25-year-old man I'd given everything for, seeing something cold and dismissive in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. "Edward, I know what I'm—" "No, you don't." Sarah's voice was sharp, cutting. She ended her call and moved toward us. "I called for an ambulance, but please step away from him, Trinity. You can't even bake a decent Christmas cake. Don't try to be a hero now." The casual cruelty of her words, referencing the slightly burnt cake I'd made yesterday while distracted by Clarence's complaints of chest tightness, made my cheeks burn with shame. But I didn't move my hands from Clarence's neck. Something deep inside me, something I'd buried for decades, refused to let go. "I'm trying to help," I said quietly, feeling Clarence's pulse strengthen slightly under my touch. Edward's face contorted with frustration. "You're not qualified. Sarah called Dr. Martinez. He's the best cardiologist in the city. He'll be here in 15 minutes. I wanted to tell him about the specific technique I was using, about why I was pressing exactly where I was pressing, about the years of training that made my hands as steady and sure as they'd ever been. But the words stuck in my throat, held back by decades of silence, of being careful not to overshadow, not to complicate, not to confuse. The next 12 minutes felt like hours. Edward paced the living room, occasionally barking orders at me to give Dad space or stop touching him. Sarah stood beside the tree, her arms crossed, watching me with something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if my helplessness in this moment proved something she'd always believed about me. I kept my fingers on Clarence's neck, monitoring his pulse, adjusting the pressure as needed. His breathing remained shallow but steady. His color was slowly improving. I knew these were good signs, but I also knew we weren't out of danger yet. When the doorbell rang, Edward practically ran to answer it. Doctor. Marcus Chen entered our living room carrying a large medical bag, his hair now silver-streaked but his movements still quick and precise. He looked exactly like the brilliant, dedicated doctor I'd always known he would become. He stopped mid-step when he saw me kneeling beside Clarence, saw exactly where my hands were positioned, saw the way I was monitoring my husband's breathing and color. His medical bag hit the floor with a soft thud. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you truly who I think you are?" Edward and Sarah immediately froze. The room went completely silent except for the soft hum of our Christmas tree lights and Clarence's steadying breath. Dr. Chen's eyes were locked on mine, and I saw recognition dawning. Not just of my face, but of my technique, my positioning, my obvious medical knowledge. After 25 years of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being called just a housewife, someone finally saw me for who I really was. My hands trembled slightly against Clarence's neck, and I felt 30 years of buried identity struggling to surface. Edward was staring at Dr. Chen with confusion, then looking back at me as if he'd never seen me before. Sarah's confident smirk had vanished completely. "Dr. Thompson," Marcus said softly, and the title felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. "Is it really you?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, kneeling on my living room floor with my husband's life literally in my hands, I realized that my carefully constructed life of invisibility was about to crumble. And I wasn't sure if I was terrified or relieved. Edward's voice cut through the tension, sharp and demanding. "What the hell is going on here? Who is Dr. Thompson?" I looked up at my son, this man I'd sacrificed everything for, and saw a stranger. Someone who'd never bothered to ask about my life before he was born, who'd never wondered why medical terminology came so naturally to me, who'd never questioned why I always knew exactly what to do in health emergencies. The Christmas lights twinkled innocently above us, casting shadows across a scene that would change everything. Clarence stirred slightly under my hands, his pulse growing stronger, and I realized that while I might be saving his life tonight, I was about to lose the quiet, uncomplicated existence I'd built for the past 25 years. The ambulance arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights painting our quiet suburban street in urgent colors. As the paramedics worked on Clarence, stabilizing him for transport, Dr. Chen pulled me aside into our kitchen. The familiar space, with its worn marble countertops and the persistent tick of our grandmother clock, suddenly felt foreign, as if I were seeing it through someone else's eyes. "Trinity Thompson," Marcus said, his voice filled with something between wonder and disbelief. "Professor Thompson, I never forgot what you did for me." Edward appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with confusion and growing anger. "Professor? Mom? What is he talking about?" I could feel Sarah hovering behind him, her earlier smugness replaced by wariness. The comfortable narrative they'd built about me, the simple housewife who couldn't even manage a Christmas cake properly, was beginning to crack. "Your mother, Dr. Chen said, turning to face Edward, was the most brilliant professor I ever had at Columbia Medical School. She literally saved my career." The words hung in the air like smoke. Edward's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "That's impossible. Mom was never a professor. She's always been a housewife," I finished quietly. "Yes, I know what I've always been to you." Dr. Chen's expression softened as he looked at me. "You taught advanced cardiology and research methods, 1993 through 1998. You were the youngest female professor to receive tenure in the department's history." I felt exposed, as if 25 years of careful camouflage had been stripped away in an instant. Sarah pushed past Edward, her eyes narrow. "This is ridiculous. Trinity barely finished high school." "Actually," Dr. Chen said, his voice gaining strength, Dr. Thompson graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School in 1989. She completed her residency in cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and published 12 groundbreaking papers on pediatric heart surgery before she was 30. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet of medical emergency. This was the silence of a world shifting on its axis, of long-held beliefs crumbling into dust. Edward slumped against the kitchen door frame. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question cut deeper than his earlier dismissal. How could I explain 25 years of silence? How could I tell him that I'd buried the most important part of myself so completely that sometimes I forgot she ever existed? "Because," I said slowly, "you needed a mother, not a doctor." "Doctor." Chen stepped forward, his eyes bright with memory. "Edward, your mother didn't just teach medicine. She transformed lives. When I started medical school, everyone thought I was hopeless. The other professors, my classmates, even the administration suggested I consider switching majors." "Why?" Sarah asked, despite herself. "I'm autistic," Dr. Chen said simply. "In the early 1990s, there wasn't much understanding or accommodation for people like me. I had trouble with social interactions, with reading facial expressions, with understanding the unspoken rules of medical hierarchy. I was brilliant with the science, but I couldn't navigate the human elements." He paused, his gaze returning to me. "Everyone gave up on me except Professor Thompson. She saw past my social awkwardness to my potential. She spent countless hours teaching me not just medicine, but how to connect with patients, how to work with colleagues, how to survive in a profession that seemed designed to exclude people like me." I remembered those sessions so clearly. Marcus sitting in my office after hours, his shoulders tense with frustration, his brilliant mind trapped behind social barriers that seemed insurmountable. I'd seen something in him that others missed, a capacity for empathy that ran deeper than conventional social skills, a dedication to healing that was pure and uncompromising. "She didn't just teach me," Dr. Chen continued. "She protected me. When other faculty members tried to have me dismissed, she fought for me. When students mocked me, she created safe spaces for me to learn. When I doubted myself, she reminded me why I wanted to become a doctor in the first place." Edward was staring at me as if I were a stranger. "You never mentioned any of this. Not once in 25 years. "You never asked," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The truth of it settled over us like dust. All these years, Edward had seen me as a simple housewife because that's all he'd ever looked for. He'd never wondered about my education, my dreams, my life before he was born. I'd become so good at being invisible that I'd convinced my own son I'd never been anything else. Sarah's voice cut through the moment, sharp with defensive anger. "Well, if you were so brilliant, why did you give it all up? Why become a housewife if you were some hotshot professor?" Dr. Chen and I exchanged a glance. He didn't know the whole story. Couldn't know about Edward's condition, about the choice I'd been forced to make. But I could see in his eyes that he understood there was more to tell. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "we make sacrifices for the people we love." The paramedics called from the living room. They were ready to transport Clarence to the hospital. As we gathered our coats and followed the stretcher outside, Dr. Chen fell into step beside me. "I need to ask," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "That technique you were using on Clarence's neck, the carotid pressure point manipulation, that's not something a layperson would know." I glanced ahead at Edward and Sarah, who were climbing into Edward's car. "I may have given up practicing medicine, Marcus, but I never stopped being a doctor." He nodded slowly. "I had a feeling. The way you assessed his condition, the precision of your hand placement, it was textbook perfect. Better than textbook, actually. You saved his life tonight, you know." "We both did," I replied. At the hospital, as Clarence was wheeled into the cardiac unit for observation, Edward finally confronted me directly. "Mom, I need to understand this. If you were really a professor, if you had this whole other life, why didn't you ever tell me? Why let me think you were just a housewife? I finished. Just someone who burned Christmas cakes and couldn't be trusted in a medical emergency. He had the grace to look ashamed. I didn't mean— Yes, you did, I said gently. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I let you think it for so long that you forgot to see anything else. Dr. Chen joined us in the waiting area, having finished his examination of Clarence. He's stable. The quick intervention prevented any serious damage. He'll make a full recovery. Edward looked between Dr. Chen and me. The quick intervention? You mean what Mom did? Exactly what your mother did, Dr. Chen confirmed. The carotid pressure technique she used is extremely advanced. She bought us the crucial time we needed. As we settled into the uncomfortable hospital chairs to wait for more news, I could feel the weight of 25 years of silence pressing down on me. Edward kept glancing at me with curious, almost suspicious eyes. Sarah sat rigid beside him, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Dr. Chen pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. Trinity, I want to show you something. I don't know if you know, but I've become the head of cardiology at Presbyterian Hospital. We've been looking for a senior consultant, someone with your experience and expertise. He showed me his phone screen, a job posting for a position that would pay more in 1 year than I'd seen in the last 10. My breath caught in my throat. I don't understand, Edward said. Are you offering my mother a job? I'm offering Dr. Thompson the recognition she should have had all along, Dr. Chen replied. As the hospital fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the sounds of medical equipment beeped in the background, I realized that my carefully controlled life was about to change in ways I couldn't predict. The question was whether I had the courage to step back into the light after 25 years in the shadows, and whether my family could handle learning who I really was underneath the woman they thought they knew. The drive home from the hospital the next morning was silent except for the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers against the light December drizzle. Clarence was stable and would be discharged in 2 days, but the weight of last night's revelations sat between Edward and me like an uninvited passenger. Sarah had gone straight to her mother's house, claiming she needed time to process everything. What she really needed, I suspected, was time to figure out how to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through her fingers. Edward pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out. The Christmas decorations on our neighbors' houses looked garish in the gray morning light, all those twinkling lights and inflatable Santas seeming to mock the heaviness that had settled over our family. Mom, Edward said finally, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. I need to understand. If you were really a professor, if you had this amazing career, why did you give it all up? What happened in 1998? 1998. The year my world changed completely. I'd been dreading this question since Dr. Chen first recognized me, knowing that once I started explaining, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction we'd all been living. You happened, I said quietly. Edward turned to face me, confusion evident in his eyes. What do you mean? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 25 years of carefully kept secrets pressing down on my chest. Edward, when you were born, you had a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. It's a congenital heart defect where the left side of the heart is severely underdeveloped. The color drained from his face. What? That's impossible. I've never had heart problems. You don't have heart problems now because of 3 surgeries you had as an infant, and because I've been monitoring your condition every single day of your life since then. We sat in the car as I told him the truth he'd never known. How he'd been born blue and barely breathing. How the doctors had given him a 30% chance of survival even with immediate surgery. How I'd held his tiny body in the NICU, feeling his irregular heartbeat against my chest, knowing that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. The surgeries were successful, I continued, watching his face carefully for signs of the distress that cardiac patients sometimes experienced when learning about their condition. But you needed constant monitoring. Your heart rhythm, your oxygen levels, your activity tolerance. Everything had to be watched. The doctor said you'd need a parent with medical knowledge to catch any complications early. Edward's voice was barely a whisper. So you quit your job? I didn't just quit my job, Edward. I quit my life. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, carrying decades of suppressed grief. I was 3 months away from being named department head at Columbia. I had a research grant worth $400,000 studying minimally invasive pediatric cardiac procedures. I had a book deal, speaking engagements lined up across the country. I was going to change how children with heart conditions were treated. He stared at me, his breath coming in short gasps that immediately triggered my maternal alarm. Even now, 25 years later, I could read the signs of cardiac distress in his body language. Slow your breathing, I said automatically. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Count to 4 on each exhale. He followed my instructions without question, the way he had 1,000 times before during childhood episodes he'd never understood were cardiac-related. As his breathing normalized, I could see him starting to piece together memories he'd never fully examined. Those times when I was little, he said slowly. When you'd make me rest in the middle of playing. When you'd check my pulse when you thought I wasn't looking. When you'd wake up in the night and come into my room. You were born with one functional ventricle, Edward. Even after the surgeries, your heart had to work 3 times as hard as a normal heart. Every fever could have triggered arrhythmia. Every playground fall could have disrupted your surgical repairs. Every growth spurt changed your cardiac output. I watched him process this, seeing the child I'd protected so carefully now, understanding the scope of that protection for the first time. But I played sports in high school, he protested. I ran track. I played basketball. Because I monitored your heart rate during every practice, charted your recovery times, adjusted your training schedule to account for your cardiac load. Do you remember how I always showed up early to pick you up? How I always had those energy drinks waiting for you? His eyes widened. Those weren't energy drinks. Electrolyte solutions specifically formulated for cardiac patients. And those vitamins I made you take every morning were actually ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. Dosages I calculated based on your weight and cardiac function. Edward got out of the car abruptly and started walking toward the house, then stopped in the middle of our front walkway. When he turned back to me, there were tears in his eyes. You've been treating me my entire life, and I never knew. That was the point, I said, getting out to join him. You needed to believe you were normal, that your life wasn't limited by your condition. If you'd grown up knowing you had a heart defect, you would have lived afraid. But the cost, he whispered. You gave up everything. I thought about the night I'd made that decision, sitting in the NICU with his 2-week-old body hooked up to monitors and machines, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. The head of pediatric cardiology at Columbia had been brutally honest. Edward would need specialized care for years, possibly his entire life. I could hire nurses, but no one would watch him with the vigilance of a mother who was also a trained cardiologist. I didn't give up everything, I said. I chose what mattered most. We went inside, and Edward immediately headed for the stairs. Where are you going? The attic, he said. If you really were a professor, if you really had this whole career, there has to be evidence somewhere. I followed him up, my heart pounding with anxiety. I'd stored everything from my previous life in boxes in the far corner of the attic, under old Christmas decorations and forgotten furniture. I'd told myself I was preserving memories, but really, I'd been preserving a person, the woman I used to be before I became just Edward's mother. He found the boxes easily, as if he'd always known where to look. Inside were my diplomas, my medical licenses, copies of my published research papers, photos from medical conferences, and thank you letters from former students. Edward handled each item carefully, reverently, as if he were discovering archaeological artifacts. Dr. Trinity Thompson, Assistant Professor of Cardiology, he read from one diploma. Harvard Medical School, summa cum laude. He looked up at me. You graduated first in your class. Second, I corrected, but close enough. He found a photo from my last faculty party at Columbia. Me, in a professional suit, surrounded by colleagues, obviously respected and valued. The woman in that photo looked confident, accomplished, fulfilled. She looked nothing like the tired housewife who'd been dismissed in her own living room just 24 hours ago. This research paper, Edward said, holding up a journal article I'd published in 1997. It's about surgical techniques for infants with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. My throat tightened. I was working on that when you were born. All my research suddenly became very personal. Edward sat heavily on an old trunk, my professional life spread around him like fragments of a shattered mirror. How many surgeries did I have? 3 major ones in your first year, then several smaller procedures to adjust the artificial valves as you grew. The last significant surgery was when you were 7. You probably don't remember it. I told you it was to fix a hernia. I remember that, he said slowly. You stayed in the hospital with me for a week. You never left my side. I was monitoring your recovery personally. The surgical team was excellent, but I knew your case history better than anyone. Edward picked up another photo, this one of me receiving an award for excellence in teaching. How much money did you lose by quitting? I'd never calculated it precisely, but the number was staggering. My salary was about $80,000 a year in 1998. With the research grants, speaking fees, and consulting work, I was probably making close to $120,000 annually. Over 25 years, Edward said, doing the math. That's millions of dollars. Money I never needed, I said firmly. You were more important than any career, any recognition, any amount of financial success. But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of those lost years pressing down on me. The research I never completed, the students I never taught, the lives I might have saved if I'd continued developing new surgical techniques. I'd made the right choice for Edward, but it had cost me more than just money. It had cost me my identity, my purpose, my sense of self-worth. Edward was quiet for a long time, sifting through the evidence of who I used to be. Finally, he looked up at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Respect mixed with guilt and a kind of awe that made my chest tighten with emotion. Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I owe you an apology that I don't think I can ever make adequately. Before I could respond, we heard Sarah's voice downstairs, sharp and angry, calling Edward's name. She'd returned, and from the tone of her voice, she wasn't ready to accept the new reality any more gracefully than she'd handled the revelations at the hospital. We should go down, Edward said, but he made no move to pack up my old life scattered across the attic floor. As we headed downstairs, I realized that opening these boxes had done more than just reveal my past to Edward. It had reminded me of who I used to be underneath all the years of quiet sacrifice. And for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't sure I was ready to pack that woman away again. Sarah stood in our living room with her arms crossed, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light filtering through our front windows. She'd changed clothes since leaving the hospital. Gone was the casual sweater she'd worn yesterday, replaced by a designer outfit that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. Everything about her posture screamed defensive aggression. Edward, we need to talk, she said, barely glancing at me. Privately. No, Edward said, surprising both of us. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Mom. Sarah's carefully controlled expression flickered. This is about our future, our family plans. Your mother doesn't need to be involved in everything. The casual dismissal, your mother doesn't need to be involved, hit me like a familiar slap. How many times over the years had Sarah made similar comments, subtly excluding me from decisions about my own son's life? Actually, Edward said, settling into his father's armchair, I think she's been more involved in my life than I ever realized. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Edward looked at me, then back at his wife. Did you know I had heart surgery as a baby? What? No, that's ridiculous. You've never had heart problems. Sarah laughed, but there was an edge to it. Edward, you're being dramatic. 3 major surgeries before I was 1 year old, Edward continued. Constant medical monitoring throughout my childhood. Specialized medications disguised as vitamins. Mom gave up her entire medical career to take care of me. Sarah went very still. Medical career? Edward, your mother never had a medical career. She barely graduated high school. I watched Sarah's face carefully, looking for the surprise and confusion that should have accompanied this revelation. Instead, I saw something else, a brief flicker of panic, quickly suppressed. She was a professor at Columbia Medical School, Edward said. A published researcher, department head candidate. She gave it all up when I was born. Sarah's laugh was forced, artificial. That's impossible. I would have known. In 8 years of marriage, something like that would have come up. But there was something in her voice, a quality I'd heard before but never quite identified. It was the sound of someone working very hard to maintain a lie. Sarah, I said quietly, you've always seemed very certain about my limitations. She turned to me, her expression shifting to the familiar condescending smile she reserved for my silly comments. Trinity, I'm just being realistic. You're a wonderful mother and wife, but let's not pretend you're something you're not. Edward frowned. What do you mean, pretend? Sarah glanced between us, clearly realizing she'd said too much. I just mean that everyone has their place, their role. Trinity's role is here, in the home, taking care of family. There's nothing wrong with that. But there would be something wrong with her having been a doctor? Edward asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's perfectly glossed lips opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. Well, no, of course not. But it's not true. Your mother has always been just a housewife. Just a housewife. There it was again, that phrase that had defined me for 25 years. But this time, hearing it from Sarah's lips, I heard something else underneath it. Relief. Sarah, I said carefully, you seem very invested in maintaining a particular image of who I am. I'm invested in reality, she snapped. I'm invested in not letting you confuse Edward with these ridiculous fantasies. Edward stood up abruptly. Fantasies? I just spent 2 hours going through Mom's diplomas, her research papers, photos from medical conferences. Are you saying those are fake? Sarah's composure was cracking. I'm saying that people can buy fake diplomas online. People can Photoshop themselves into pictures. People can create elaborate lies when they're desperate for attention. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but before I could respond, Edward was moving toward the stairs. Come with me, he said to Sarah. I want you to see something. I followed them back up to the attic, where my professional life still lay scattered across the floor. Edward picked up my medical license, the original, with raised seals and official signatures. This is fake? He asked, handing it to Sarah. Sarah examined it, her hands trembling slightly. Well, no, but how about this? Edward held up a photo of me with Dr. Chen and 3 other faculty members at a cardiology symposium. Did Mom Photoshop herself into a picture with the man who treated Dad last night? Sarah stared at the photo, her face growing pale. I don't understand how... Or this? Edward picked up a thank you letter from a former student, dated 1997. Did Mom forge this too? And this one? And this stack of 50 others? With each piece of evidence, Sarah seemed to shrink smaller. But instead of the surprise and apology I might have expected, her expression was hardening into something cold and calculating. Fine, she said finally. Maybe you did have some kind of career once, but you gave it up, didn't you? You chose to be a housewife. You chose this life. Because Edward needed... I began. Because you couldn't handle the pressure, Sarah interrupted. Because when things got difficult, you took the easy way out. Edward's face darkened. Easy way out? Sarah, she sacrificed everything to save my life. Did she? Sarah's voice was rising now, her careful facade completely abandoned. Or did she use your condition as an excuse to quit when she realized she wasn't as good as she thought she was? The cruelty of the accusation took my breath away, but before I could respond, Edward was speaking, his voice dangerously quiet. What did you just say? Sarah seemed to realize she'd gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. I'm just saying that people sometimes exaggerate their past accomplishments when their current life feels disappointing. Maybe your mother had some minor teaching position, maybe she helped with some research, but this whole brilliant professor story? It's probably embellished. Get out, Edward said. What? Get out of my house. Get out of my parents' house. Get out now. Sarah's eyes widened. Edward, you're overreacting. I'm just trying to protect you from… From what? From learning that my mother is an extraordinary woman who gave up everything for me? From discovering that I've been treating her like garbage for years based on your constant subtle undermining? The word undermining hit me like revelation. Suddenly, years of seemingly innocent comments from Sarah came into sharp focus. Her surprise whenever I demonstrated any knowledge or capability, her quick dismissals of my opinions on medical matters, her habit of redirecting conversations whenever my past might come up naturally. Sarah, I said slowly, how long have you known? She went very still. Known what? About my background, about my education and career. I don't know what you mean. But Edward was already moving, pulling out his phone. I'm going to call my cousin Rachel. Remember her? She works in human resources at Columbia Medical School. Let's see what their records show about Dr. Trinity Thompson. Edward, wait! Sarah's composure cracked completely. Fine. Yes, I knew. The admission hung in the air like a confession. How long? Edward demanded. Sarah's shoulders sagged. Since before we got married. I was doing research on your family for the wedding planning, and I found some old articles online about your mother's work at Columbia. 8 years. She'd known for 8 years and had never said a word. Worse than that, she'd actively worked to reinforce the image of me as incapable, limited, just a housewife. Why? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. Sarah's mask was completely gone now, revealing something ugly and insecure underneath. Because you already had too much influence over Edward. He respected you, looked up to you. If he'd known you were this brilliant doctor who'd sacrificed everything for him, I never would have been able to build my own life with him. The truth was stunning in its calculated cruelty. For 8 years, Sarah had deliberately maintained my invisibility because my true identity threatened her control over Edward. You wanted him to see me as weak, I said. I wanted him to see you as human, Sarah shot back. Not as some saint who gave up everything. That's a lot of pressure to put on a person, knowing their mother sacrificed her whole career for them. Edward's voice was barely controlled. So you spent 8 years making sure my mother felt worthless so that I wouldn't feel guilty? I spent 8 years protecting our marriage, Sarah said. And it worked, didn't it? We've been happy. Happy? Edward looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. We've been happy because you systematically destroyed my relationship with my mother? Because you made me believe she was incompetent and useless? Sarah's face crumpled slightly, but her voice remained defiant. She chose to give up her career. She chose to become a housewife. I just helped maintain the boundaries she'd already established. By making sure those boundaries became a prison, I said quietly. The three of us stood among the scattered evidence of my former life, the weight of 8 years of deception settling over us like dust. I thought about all the times Sarah had discouraged Edward from asking about my thoughts on medical news, all the times she'd redirected conversations when my knowledge might have shown through, all the times she'd reinforced the image of me as simple, limited, just a housewife. I need you to leave, Edward said to Sarah, his voice hollow. I need you to pack your things and go stay somewhere else while I figure out what this means for our marriage. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her. Edward, please. I love you. I was just trying to protect what we had. By destroying my relationship with my mother, Edward said. By making me complicit in treating her like she was worthless for 8 years. As Sarah gathered her purse and coat, moving with the defeated posture of someone whose careful construction had collapsed completely, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: clarity. The woman I used to be, the confident, accomplished professor, was still there, buried under years of deliberate diminishment, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to let her breathe again. Dr. Chen's call came 3 days after Christmas, while I was sitting in Clarence's hospital room watching him sleep peacefully, his heart monitor showing the steady, strong rhythm that his medication had restored. Edward had gone home to shower and change clothes. He'd barely left the hospital since Sarah moved out, as if he was afraid that leaving me alone might somehow make me disappear too. Trinity. Dr. Chen's voice was warm but professional through my phone. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. How is Clarence doing? Much better, thank you. They're releasing him tomorrow. That's wonderful news. Listen, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the consulting position. The hospital board met yesterday, and they're very excited about the possibility of bringing you on board. They'd like to offer you the position officially. I gripped the phone tighter, watching Clarence's chest rise and fall with the easy breathing of someone whose crisis had passed. What would the position involve? Senior consultant in pediatric cardiology, with the option to take on research projects and mentor residents. The salary would be $120,000 annually, with full benefits and research funding available. You'd have your own office, your own staff, and complete autonomy over your caseload. $120,000. More money than I'd seen in 25 years combined. But more than that, it was recognition, purpose, the chance to use the knowledge I'd spent decades keeping hidden. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen continued. We have a case that specifically requires your expertise. A 3-month-old girl with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, very similar to Edward's case. The parents are struggling with the decision about surgery versus palliative care. Your experience, both professional and personal, could make the difference in saving this child's life. My throat tightened. Another baby facing the same crisis Edward had faced. Another family torn apart by impossible choices. When would you need an answer? The board would like to make the announcement next week. Trinity, this isn't charity. We need you. Your research on minimally invasive techniques is still being cited in current literature. You have insights that no one else in the field possesses. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet hospital room, listening to the soft beep of Clarence's monitors and watching the winter afternoon fade outside the windows. For 25 years, I'd told myself that sacrificing my career was the only choice, the right choice. But now, faced with the possibility of reclaiming that part of myself, I wasn't sure I had the courage to take such a dramatic step. Clarence stirred, opening his eyes and immediately focusing on me with the clarity of someone fully recovered. Who was that on the phone? I told him about Dr. Chen's offer, about the position and the salary and the chance to practice medicine again. Clarence listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. What do you want to do? He asked when I finished. I don't know, I admitted. It's been so long since I thought about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed. Clarence reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady. Trinity, I've watched you sacrifice everything for this family for 25 years. Maybe it's time you did something for yourself. Before I could respond, Edward appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand and a troubled expression on his face. Mom, we need to talk. Sarah's been calling me nonstop. She wants to come back, wants to work things out. I felt my stomach clench. What did you tell her? That I'm not ready to talk to her yet, but she's not giving up. Edward sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. She keeps saying she was just trying to protect our marriage, that she never meant to hurt you. And what do you think? Clarence asked his son. Edward was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I think she systematically destroyed my relationship with my mother for 8 years, and I'm not sure that's something I can forgive. But, I prompted, hearing the uncertainty in his voice. But we've been married for 8 years. We have a house together, plans for the future. Am I supposed to throw all that away because she made a mistake? I looked at my son, this man who'd spent his entire life not knowing how precarious his existence had been, not understanding the depth of love that had kept him alive. Even now, with the full truth revealed, he was struggling to navigate the complex emotions of betrayal and loyalty. Edward, I said gently, this wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate, sustained campaign to keep you from knowing who I really was. The question you need to ask yourself is, can you trust someone who worked so hard to manipulate your relationships? Before he could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah. Trinity, please call me. We need to talk. I know I hurt you, but I love Edward. I love this family. There has to be a way to fix this. I showed the message to Edward, who sighed deeply. She's been sending me messages like that all morning. Are you considering reconciliation? Clarence asked. Edward rubbed his temples. I don't know what I'm considering. Everything I thought I knew about my life has been turned upside down in the past week. My phone rang, Sarah's number. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. Trinity, thank God. Sarah's voice was thick with tears. Please, I need to explain. I need you to understand why I did what I did. I understand perfectly, I said. You were threatened by my relationship with Edward, so you made sure he saw me as incompetent and useless. No, that's not... Sarah's voice cracked. Okay, maybe at first that was part of it, but it became more complicated than that. The longer it went on, the harder it became to tell the truth. How do you suddenly announce that your mother-in-law is actually a brilliant doctor when you've spent years reinforcing the opposite? You could have stopped reinforcing it, Edward said, having moved close enough to hear the conversation. Edward? Sarah's voice brightened with desperate hope. Sweetheart, please let me come home. Let me explain in person. Sarah, I interjected, there's something you should know. Dr. Chen has offered me a position at Presbyterian Hospital. I'm considering accepting it. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. What kind of position? Sarah finally asked, her voice carefully controlled. Senior consultant in pediatric cardiology, $120,000 a year. Another silence, this one longer and more ominous. Trinity, Sarah said, and I could hear her struggling to keep her tone reasonable. Do you really think that's wise? You've been out of medicine for 25 years. The field has changed enormously. You'd be setting yourself up for failure and embarrassment. Actually, Edward said, his voice hard, Mom has been practicing medicine every day for 25 years. She's been managing my cardiac condition with more skill than most cardiologists. But in a real hospital setting, with real responsibilities. Sarah, I interrupted, feeling a surge of the confidence I'd buried for decades. I graduated second in my class from Harvard Medical School. I published groundbreaking research that's still being cited today. I successfully managed a complex pediatric cardiac case for 25 years, without a single major complication. I think I can handle a consulting position. But what about Edward? Sarah's voice became shrill. What about Clarence? What about your family responsibilities? The question hung in the air like an accusation. It was the same argument that had convinced me to give up everything 25 years ago. Family came first. Personal ambitions were selfish. A good mother and wife sacrificed everything for others. But this time I had backup. Sarah, Edward said firmly, Mom has spent 25 years putting this family first. If she wants to have a career again, she has my complete support. Mine too, Clarence added from his hospital bed. Sarah's breathing was audible through the phone. This is a mistake. You're all making a huge mistake. Trinity, you can't just walk back into medicine after 25 years and expect to succeed. You'll humiliate yourself and you'll damage this family in the process. The only thing damaging this family, Edward said, is your inability to accept that Mom is more than the limited person you tried to make her believe she was. I'm coming over, Sarah said. We're going to settle this face to face. No, Edward said. Don't come to the hospital. Don't come to the house. I'm not ready to see you yet. Edward, please. He hung up. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of crossed lines and burned bridges settling over us. I thought about the baby Dr. Chen had mentioned, the 3-month-old girl whose parents were struggling with the same impossible decision I'd faced when Edward was born. I thought about the research I could resume, the students I could teach, the difference I could make in the world beyond the walls of my suburban home. But I also thought about the comfortable routine Clarence and I had built, about the quiet satisfaction of managing a household, about the fear of stepping back into a professional world that had moved on without me. Mom, Edward said quietly, I need you to know something. Whatever you decide about this job offer, it should be your decision. Not based on what Sarah wants, not based on what you think I need, not based on anyone's expectations except your own. I looked at my son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time as an adult, as a person capable of understanding complex emotions and difficult truths. What if I fail? I asked, voicing the fear I'd been carrying since Dr. Chen first made the offer. What if you succeed? Clarence countered from his hospital bed. That evening, after Edward had gone home and Clarence had fallen asleep, I walked the hospital corridors, past the nurses' stations and patient rooms, breathing in the familiar scent of antiseptic and possibility. I found myself in the pediatric wing, standing outside the NICU where babies fought for their lives with the same determination Edward had shown 25 years ago. Through the window, I could see tiny forms in incubators, surrounded by the monitors and machines that had once surrounded my son. I thought about the knowledge I carried, the experience that could help save some of these lives, the research that could improve outcomes for countless families facing the same crisis we'd faced. Sarah was right about one thing. It was a risk. After 25 years, stepping back into medicine would be challenging, possibly overwhelming. But for the first time in decades, the voice in my head wasn't asking whether I was capable enough. A few months later, I stood in my new office at Presbyterian Hospital, watching the morning sun stream through windows that overlooked the city I'd once thought I'd left behind forever. My white coat hung on the back of my chair, freshly pressed and bearing the embroidered name Dr. Trinity Thompson, Senior Consultant, Pediatric Cardiology. After 25 years, seeing my title in professional stitching still made my heart race with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The transition back to medicine hadn't been easy. The technology had advanced dramatically, treatment protocols had evolved, and I'd spent the first month feeling like I was learning a new language built on a foundation I'd almost forgotten I possessed. But gradually, like muscle memory returning to a dancer, the knowledge had reasserted itself. The steady hands that had once performed complex procedures found their precision again. The analytical mind that had once diagnosed complex cases remembered how to see patterns and symptoms. Most importantly, I'd discovered that 25 years of intensively managing Edward's condition had kept my skills sharper than I'd realized. While I'd been out of formal practice, I'd never stopped being a cardiologist. The soft knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Dr. Thompson, your 9 o'clock appointment is here. I smiled at my assistant, Maria, who'd been patient with my sometimes old-fashioned approaches to scheduling and record-keeping. Please send them in. The Johnsons entered my office carrying their 3-month-old daughter, Emma. the baby Dr. Chen had mentioned during that pivotal phone call 6 months ago. Emma had been born with the same condition as Edward, and her parents had been struggling with the decision about surgery for months before finally requesting a consultation with me. "Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Johnson said, settling into the chair across from my desk while cradling Emma carefully. "Thank you for agreeing to see us. We've been to 4 different specialists, and everyone gives us different advice." I looked at Emma, seeing Edward's tiny face from 25 years ago in her delicate features and slightly blue-tinged skin. The familiar protective instinct surged through me, but this time it was tempered with professional knowledge and emotional distance. "Tell me about your concerns," I said, pulling Emma's thick medical file toward me. For the next hour, I walked the Johnsons through the same decision tree I'd navigated when Edward was born. I explained the surgical options, the risks and benefits, the long-term prognosis with and without intervention. But more than medical facts, I shared something no other doctor could: the perspective of someone who'd lived with the consequences of this choice for 25 years. "The surgery isn't a cure," I told them honestly. "It's the beginning of a lifetime of careful management. Your daughter will always have a heart condition, but with proper care and monitoring, she can live a full, normal life." Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. "How do you live with that fear? How do you watch your child grow up knowing their heart could fail at any moment?" I thought about Edward, now 26 and thriving, working as an engineer and slowly rebuilding his marriage with Sarah, though on very different terms than before. I thought about the thousands of moments of fear and vigilance, but also about the joy of watching him succeed despite his challenges. "You learn to see strength where others see vulnerability," I said. "You learn that love is measured not in the absence of worry, but in the determination to fight for every day you have together." After the Johnsons left, having decided to proceed with the surgery, I found myself thinking about the strange circular path my life had taken. I'd left medicine to save Edward, and now I'd returned to medicine to save other children facing the same battle he'd fought. My phone buzzed with a text from Edward. "How's your first week with the new research grant going?" I smiled, typing back, "Better than expected. The minimally invasive techniques are showing promising results." The research grant, $250,000 to study improved surgical techniques for complex pediatric cardiac conditions, represented more than just professional validation. It was a chance to complete the work I'd started 25 years ago, using everything I'd learned during Edward's treatment to help other families. Another text came in, this one from Clarence. "Dinner ready when you get home. Made your favorite." The balance I'd found wasn't perfect. I still worried about Edward's heart, still managed his medications during family visits, still felt the pull between professional obligations and family needs. But it was a balance I'd chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of the costs and benefits. Sarah had moved back in with Edward 3 months ago, but their relationship was fundamentally different now. She'd started therapy to address what the counselor called her control issues and insecurity-based manipulation patterns. And more importantly, she'd apologized to me, not the quick surface apology she'd offered initially, but a deep acknowledgement of the damage her actions had caused. "I was afraid," she'd told me during an awkward coffee meeting in February. "I was afraid that if Edward knew how extraordinary you were, he'd realize how ordinary I was." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding. Sarah had been operating from her own fears and insecurities, just as I'd been operating from mine. The difference was that I'd made my choices to protect others, while she'd made hers to protect herself. A knock on my office door brought me back to the present. Dr. Chen entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bringing good news. "I just got off the phone with the Johnsons," he said, handing me one of the cups. "They wanted me to tell you that Emma's surgery went perfectly. She's stable, responding well, and they credit our consultation with giving them the confidence to proceed." I felt the familiar warm rush of satisfaction that came with helping save a life. It was a feeling I'd forgotten during my years as a housewife, when success was measured in clean laundry and home-cooked meals rather than beating hearts and healing bodies. Speaking of good news, Dr. Chen continued, the board approved your proposal for the mentorship program. Starting next month, you'll be working directly with medical students who are interested in pediatric cardiology. Teaching again. The prospect filled me with excitement and terror in equal measure. Medical students were brilliant and eager, but they were also demanding and skeptical. Could I command their respect? Could I share my knowledge effectively after so many years away from the classroom? Marcus, I said, can I ask you something? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd given up when everyone was telling you that you weren't suited for medicine? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think about it sometimes, but I also know that I'm a better doctor because of those struggles. The empathy I learned from being dismissed and underestimated makes me better with difficult patients. The determination I developed fighting for my place in medicine makes me fight harder for my patients' lives. He paused, looking at me with the same intense focus he'd had as a struggling student 25 years ago. Trinity, you didn't lose 25 years. You invested them. Everything you learned caring for Edward, every skill you developed managing his condition, every insight you gained from being a medical professional working outside the system, it all made you uniquely qualified for this position. That evening, I drove home through the familiar suburban streets, past the houses where I'd spent 25 years being invisible. But now I saw the neighborhood differently. Instead of a place where I'd been trapped, it was a place where I'd chosen to build a life, where I'd raised a child who was thriving despite enormous challenges, where I'd created something valuable even when others couldn't see its worth. Clarence was in the kitchen when I arrived, stirring something that smelled like the chicken and rice dish he'd been perfecting since his heart attack. Edward was there too, sitting at our old kitchen table with his laptop open, working on some engineering project that required the kind of spatial thinking his surgically repaired heart somehow made possible. How was work, Dr. Thompson? Edward asked with a grin, emphasizing my title the way he'd been doing for months. Not to mock, but to celebrate the return of a part of me he'd never known existed. Satisfying, I said, hanging my coat on the back of my chair and settling into the domestic routine that still anchored my days. I helped a family make a decision about their baby's heart surgery. The same kind Edward had? Clarence asked, not looking up from his stirring. Exactly the same. And because of everything I learned taking care of Edward, I could give them hope along with medical facts. Edward looked up from his laptop. So, my heart condition actually helped you help someone else? Your heart condition taught me more about medicine than any textbook or medical journal ever could, I said. It taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about living fully, despite what can't be perfectly fixed. As we settled into dinner, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me back to myself. I'd given up everything to save Edward, and in doing so, I'd discovered that the most profound medical knowledge comes not from studying disease, but from loving someone through it. The woman I'd been 25 years ago, the ambitious professor with her research grants and academic accolades, had been accomplished but incomplete. The woman I'd become during those years of invisibility, patient, intuitive, deeply experienced in the day-to-day reality of managing chronic conditions, was equally valuable. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I was both people at once, Dr. Thompson and Edward's mother, researcher and caregiver, professional and family woman. It wasn't perfect balance, but it was authentic balance, built on truth rather than sacrifice, on choice rather than resignation. My phone buzzed with an email from the hospital, a new case consultation, a family seeking guidance about their newborn's complex cardiac condition. 25 years ago, I'd walked away from cases like this to focus on one child. Now, I was walking toward them, bringing everything that experience had taught me. I looked around our kitchen table, at Clarence, whose near-death experience had revealed the strength of our marriage, at Edward, whose lifelong health challenges had made him compassionate and resilient. At the space where Sarah would soon sit again, working to rebuild relationships on a foundation of honesty rather than control. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.